We go with assignment 2. So same type of situation. We want to figure out what purchase price will yield us 10% cash on cash for this property. Once again, using our quick underwriting template, we're going to get the income from the rent roll, assume 50% for expenses because we're not looking at profit and loss statements yet. And then we're going to assume the same debt terms. And here's the video. So first thing we need to do is go back over here to our underwriting template here. And let's put in the underwriting date, 1/5/20. I did it again, 2020. Property name is going to be assignment to property. All there is to it. Let's go ahead and fill out our residual numbers over here. So like we said before, 3% closing cost, typically a good assumption. We'll talk about later how this is kind of capped at 150,000 for larger properties, but on smaller properties, like 200 units and below, this is pretty good. One loan point cost. This is usually what a lender or a mortgage broker is going to charge you to originate that loan for you. It's well worth paying the point. Sometimes when you start going directly to specific lenders, you can get around this, but if you're using a mortgage broker, it's very, very much worth the money to pay this, get you better debt terms. Anyway, acquisition fee of 3%. CapEx, let's do our same 2,000 a door just to start off here. So multiply that by number of units. And then down payment, we said it was going to be 80% leverage, so 20% down. CapEx financed to 0. I'm putting this as 0 for now for simplicity, but some loans are, you hear loan to value. There's also LTC or loan to cost. Some lenders will let you roll some of this CapEx over here into the loan, and it can be a good thing. So it's just something to know about. But anyway, interest rate, what did I say? 4.25 or 4.5? Let's see, 4.5. So 4.5%. Amortization term, we said it was first year IO. One thing I didn't mention in the previous video, when we look at interest only in the first year, and then this will come to light once we start looking at multi-year pro formas, but you need to be very careful with interest only. I'm going to do this one a little bit differently just to show you the difference here, because I built this calculator to actually work with calculating the principal and interest payments as well as interest only, as you can see here below. So let's just assume that the amortization term here is 30, which is it's what the loan is, and it's what it will be after the interest only period. What's going to happen, just for fun, let me put in 5 million here just to demonstrate what these numbers are. So the IO is your interest only payment. That's what this payment would be. You'll notice we did this in our previous template. If I put this to 250, those two numbers match, right? If I put it to 30, it's going to calculate what your principal and interest payment would be. So this is what your payment's going to snap to after that 1 year of interest only expires. The lender knows this. The lender's going to look at this. So when we're looking at debt service coverage ratio, you're going to want to check that with principal and interest payment as well, because the lender will. In addition, you want to make sure you understand what your cash on cash return is with interest only and without, because guess what happens in year 2? If you haven't made up enough ground while you have the interest only payments, and all of a sudden it snaps back to principal and interest, and all of a sudden you're losing money because you're paying $63,000 more, it can be a problem. So we'll do some trades with that in a minute to make sure we understand that concept. So again, we're going to ignore this for now. This is for future topics. Now let's go ahead and put in our $300 CapEx reserve that we talked about. Again, this is the $300 per unit per year that the lender is going to hold back to make sure that you have money to take care of the asset. It's not a lot of money, but it is something that they like to do. And we'll talk more about this here in a minute as well. So let's revert over to our rent roll. Now you'll notice this one looks a little bit different, and I did this on purpose. Rent rolls come in all shapes and sizes. It's irritating because especially these, you've got to be a little more savvy in Excel to figure out how to get them into a table format that you can do easy summations with, but it's not that bad, I promise. So this is an auto-generated one, I believe, from either a program called Rent Manager or Appfolio. They look very similar. So Anyway, so let's look through this and see what we have. Unit numbers, unit type, that's some sort of a code, square footage, resident, looks like a resident ID, resident name. Then you have the market rent, which we said be careful of. It's not always accurate. Now, some of these bigger complexes are going to have charge codes. So you'll have things like rent, which is obvious. And then you'll have RUBS. RUBS water is what that's trying to say. That's like there's many different names for this acronym, but effectively it's residential utility bill back system or something like that. But billing back utilities is what they're doing if it's not sub-metered. Building facility, it's probably some sort of a charge. Key lock, they must have locked their keys here or lost their keys. So it keeps track of all the charges on a given account at any given time. And then like we talked about before, deposits. That's interesting. There's not a whole lot of deposits on this one. Scroll down. Wonders never cease. Later, we would dig into that if we decide we like this property. Move in, lease expiration, move out, and then, of course, balance is kind of where we talked about people being late. I see 1 month or one person being kind of late there. Some people looks like they paid in advance. This guy's getting up there. Doesn't look too scary. Anyway, the good thing about these, it's very difficult to just go down here and sum things up unless you do a sum if formula, which we can talk about that later if any of you don't know how to do that. Google is your friend with Excel, by the way. You can learn a lot of cool stuff. Anyway, so let's scroll down to the bottoms. With these fancy rent rolls, typically they're computer generated, so they're accurate as long as the data put into the computer was accurate. But if I come down to the bottom here, we have some nice summary tables, which is exactly what we want. Now, you do need to read these because sometimes they can be a little bit different, so forgive me if I take a second to figure this out. But summary of charges by charge codes, you can kind of see that number. It looks like our rent is here. They have a total, so this is showing, let's see, we see rent office. It looks like an employee rent credit, office credit, pet fees, utility reimbursement. It's got some storage, okay. Rent concessions. This is, when you see those signs on the side of buildings saying, hey, free flat screen TV if you move in this week. That's a rent concession. It's whatever they have to give away to get you in. So it looks like the rent concession is probably how much they took off each month's rent, or maybe gave you a month free rent or something like that. And concessions would probably be things that they gave away, like maybe an upgrade to the apartment or like a light fixture or something like that. So anyway, we understand the charges. Now let's go look and get our actual income here. So if I look at so they're going to summarize the groups. We have current notice vacant residents, future residents, occupied units. I'm going to guess those are adding together, not necessarily. Okay. Total non-rev units. And total vacant units. Let me think about this for a second. Very interesting. Okay, well, for simplicity, we're going to use I just fell into my own trap there. That's market rent. We need to see the actual. See, I told you I didn't know I was going to trip myself up. Sometimes these do take a second to stare at and understand to make sure that you know what you're looking at. Sometimes they're done a little screwy. Let's scroll back up. What were these columns here at the top? So column G, this is market rent, and this is where rent would be under amount. So column H. So if we go back down to the bottom here, column H. Okay. So we're going to go with this 110,197. This looks to be kind of the all-inclusive number, including all the rent and all the charges. Here we go, down below. I'm an idiot. We have all of our charges summed into this. So that's kind of our total monthly income on this property. So let's go ahead and take that over before I confuse myself again. And remember, we have to multiply it by 12. So let's do that. Paste it here. Boom. Yes, I want to do that. And then if we go back over here, let's go ahead and do our 50% expenses times this. 661. Number of units we need to go get. I think this was 107 or 108 unit property, if I'm not mistaken. This is one I actually almost bought and I lost it in the fourth quarter. Can you believe it? It hurts so bad. But I wasn't about to pay what the other guy did. So, number of units, 148. 148 units. Is that correct? Is that what I remember? Total vacant, total occupied, current. Okay, we'll go with 148 for now. I think that's what it is. We could always sum it up, but I don't want y'all to have to sit here while I do this anyway. So, I don't know if that was correct. Okay, sure. So what I did discover is that 148 units, $5 million is way too cheap. That is definitely not what that property sold for. Let's start again at equals, I'm going to say 80,000 again. This was also a Chattanooga property. It's a different part of Chattanooga. 11.8 million. So if we have all of our numbers in here correctly, we do. Okay. So stepping through our numbers, gross income, total expenses at 50%, CapEx reserves about 44.4 grand. Debt service is here. That makes sense. Now notice one thing. The debt service here, it's being calculated as the P&I, principal and interest, not the interest only. So the first number that we see here, cash flow before taxes, that's going to be how much money we have left over with principal and interest. Now you see down here below, I calculate in this spreadsheet cash on cash return, which is exactly how these numbers reflect. But then for reference, I also put cash on cash return interest only. Now that's what this would look like. I'm going to show you how this works, because if I go over here and I change this back to 250 to represent interest only, like we talked about, you see where I'm pointing? If I do that, no, you can't. Right here. So if I hit this number, then you see that cash on cash return matches the IO. So they're interest only. So I just wanted you to show that that's how we arrive at that number. It's just kind of baked into that cell. So we'll put it back. But so if I didn't get interest only on this property and I had to pay full principal and interest up front on day one, then I'm going to be looking at a 1.2% cash on cash return. That's nothing. Like don't ever do that, please. Even at interest only, I'm only at 5.5%. Debt service coverage ratio is 1.07. That should be a glaring red for you. That's below 1.25 and even 1.3. The lenders won't do that, so there's no way we can get this loan. So we have to say, hey, Mr. Broker, if this is where you want to list this at, or Mr. Seller, I'm sorry, like I don't know any bank that can finance that. I mean, good luck finding somebody with 11.8 million in their pocket that just wants to dump it into one property. So let's start ratcheting this down. Let's go to 70,000 per door, because that brings us down to 10.3. It's getting a little better. It's still kind of skinny. If we look at it like this, we've got cash on cash return, 3.7% if I don't get interest only, 7.9% if I do. If I look at my debt service coverage ratio, it still doesn't quite make the mark, because remember, the lender is going to look at it with principal and interest payments, so I got to measure that based on this 3.7%. Cap rate 6.4%. I happen to know that that's kind of in line with where, unfortunately, with where the Chattanooga cap rate is. So that's, from a cap rate perspective, it's not unreasonable, and that's exactly where they'll be selling this property at. In fact, I think it is where it's sold at, a little bit more actually. But Let's drop it down even more. Where can we buy it at? So 65,000 a door, 9.6 brings us to cash on cash return of 5.2 in year one, 9.4 on this. This property just didn't, we had a lot of trouble getting this property to hunt, if I remember correctly. Let's go down even more. Let's take it down to 55. Drastic move. Okay, that got us up there. So now we're kind of at the range where cash on cash return is 9. If I did principal and interest only, debt service coverage ratio is now out of trouble. Cap rate is at 8. I'll never get it at that. I'd love to try, but this is one of those things you could say, hey, broker, here's what I'm going to offer. And say, yeah, get lost. So we're going to have to ratchet that back up a little bit. Let's try 60,000. Okay, where does that put us? Like I told you, let's just try to get this down to 10%. And I'm going to cheat here because I know a little trick. If we go to data, what if analysis, goal seek, and I say set cell B or C20, which is our cash on cash return interest only. I'm going to do that just to be consistent with our other example. To value 0.1 for 10% by changing cell purchase price. And I hit go. Excel will do so. Whoops. Sorry, it doesn't like to do that when you have a formula in the cell. Let's try again. So C20 set to 0.1 by changing cell 8.8. Look at that, gets me pretty close. So basically I have to buy this at 63,000 a door to get to my 10.1%. My debt service coverage ratio is at 1.3. We see that once I get down to, if I did have to start paying principal and interest again, it'd be 6%. It's not great, but I mean, we're kind of in that realm where if I'm going to buy this property, I better be able to do something to it. And if I go spend $2,000 a door, like we just talked about over here in the CapEx need, if I go spend $2,000 a door, I better be able to raise the rents a little bit, get some return on my investment. So we'll talk about that in future examples of what year one, year two, year three looks like, and make sure that by the time this interest only burns off, we're not down at that 6%. We should be increasing in return, hopefully, right? Make our investors happy. And just one more thing to conclude here. The cash distributions, this is kind of a simple syndication model. It gets much more complex than this, but from a simple perspective, if I say, okay, look, I'm going to do the general partnership, which would be my team, is going to keep 30% of this deal for doing all the asset management, pushing the value add play, assembling the deal, all that kind of stuff that we do. Managing investor relations, things like that. The limited partners are going to be the people who want to passively invest in this deal. So they're going to put up, a good chunk, if not all, of the down payment, but they're going to want to get paid in returns of that. So they're going to have an equity ownership. They're going to get 70% of the deal. 30-70 is a pretty common split. It does get better than that. It does get worse than that. I've seen people go down to 10, but bottom line is, out of the available cash flow, which is our 163,000 right here, that cash flow before taxes, it's going to take 30% of that and say that's for the general partnership, and it's going to take 70% of that and say that is for the limited partnership, and then it's going to calculate the investor return. And this is where you got to be careful, because you need to make sure that you can pay your investors at least 7% throughout the hold period. Now, granted, that does not mean they're only making 7%. They're going to make their 7% during the hold period in cash flow, but big payday comes when we sell this puppy and it's now worth $15 million in 5 years or something like that, right? So we'll talk more about total annual return and everything like that later, but just wanted you to understand what that was doing. Anyway, so see you next time, and good night.